Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I had a client visiting me the other day, and we had an interesting conversation. Somebody who has lived in multiple different parts of the world which have quite different structures in terms of how they operate. And we had a great conversation regarding something that I figured I'd bring up today, which is really kind of this idea of adapting to a different culture, and specifically how there's certain paradigms you bring that can be really harmful to you and you just kind of don't know how to make sense of. You might be uncomfortable with them, but if you understand it, it's really important to being able to kind of make the transition to live in different parts of the world and have just much more success. So today I'm going to discuss that with you. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit all notifications, and if you'd like help with these subjects of international tax optimization, asset protection, getting residencies, citizenships, figuring out where to relocate, how to set up your company abroad, banking, etc., please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay. So what is this thing that we're discussing? Well, it might be nicely described by some of the German clients that I've had who you may talk to, and they will often be extremely concerned about following the rules precisely in some third world part of the country that they're relocating to, or even second world part of the country, part of the world that they're relocating to. And there's this idea, I've talked to them before, where they'll say, as a German coming from Germany, the idea of not being very much with lockstep with the law is a very strange concept. And I think the opposite can also be true. You'll see this as immigrants coming from, somewhere in Africa, somewhere possibly in India, etc., where there's maybe a different way that people are used to doing things, and they come into some other country and they, maybe have a hard time adapting into that system. And so I wanted to talk about this today. So let's use some simple examples here. So one of the things is there's certain parts of the world where there's just very low enforcement about rules. So there might be rules, right? But they're poorly enforced. Another is there's corruption, right? So the way that things aren't necessarily the way that they are. Then there's other places where things are ambiguous. This client was talking about how, coming from one of the countries that he's lived in, if you hear, hey, the law is vague, that means, oh great, that means there's a loophole. And that's kind of the attitude in that country, which is quite different from the previous country that he was in, where, it was not that way. And I think this can go either way, right? If you're transitioning from one culture to the next culture, you kind of have to be aware of what you're getting into. It's one of the things I've often found kind of interesting about policies on, say, American companies. You'll see, I remember years and years ago when I was graduating from post-secondary school, I was listening to recruiters, etc., from some international companies, and they were talking about the concerns of the companies being involved in bribery in those other parts of the world. But the reality was, in that part of the world, bribery was kind of how you did business, right? And it's really difficult if you go into an environment where bribery is the norm to succeed at all. I remember a good friend of mine had relocated to Canada from Ukraine, and he'd had a company that imported HVAC systems from Turkey into Ukraine and would sell them. And he was talking about how every time you got to the border, this was, I don't know, in the probably 10 years ago or so, that you would have to negotiate with the border guards on what the bribes were. And this was part of the way that business was done. And if you tried to take a very by-the-book approach in that situation, what would have happened to you? You would have been eaten alive by the market, right? By contrast, if you took that same approach and went to some place like Denmark, you would probably go and get thrown in prison, right? So you kind of have to understand that when you're going, a good friend and client of mine described it well. They just relocated, and he was talking about, learning the rules of the jungle that they live in. And when you change jungles, you need to discover what are the rules of that jungle. So Some of this is in certain places, the laws are really strict. In some places, the laws are really well enforced. In other places, the laws are not very strict. In other places, they're not very well enforced. In some places, there's bribery and corruption that's pretty normal. In other places, that's completely abnormal. And if you try and behave such that, hey, listen, I'm going to take my ideas from Germany and relocate into Mexico, probably not going to work out that well. If, on the other hand, you take the behaviors from Mexico and try and relocate to Germany, probably won't work that well, right? It's kind of that old expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And so in that sense, I think it's worth, as we understand the world and as we do our planning of what kind of life we want to create, to be really aware and conscious of how are things in the places that we want to go. And I remember seeing this actually with bankers. This was maybe 5-6 years ago, it was around the time that FATCA was being brought in. And Singapore bankers would talk to someone, this particular person was from Australia originally and was relocating to the US and was fairly well off. And the bankers would say, oh, you're from Australia? Proud, not super excited to deal with you. You're from, the US? Don't want to deal with you at all. Oh, you're from Indonesia? Oh, then just evade taxes. That's what everybody's doing. Just set up a BVI company. And notice how, the structure of where those people were dictated like a completely different manner of behavior on the part of the bankers, right? So, you can use that to your favor and you can use that against you. I've often talked to some people about how life in Eastern Europe, on the one hand, you're not going to get in a lot of these smaller countries the same level of conveniences and services, etc., as you would get in some place like, say, UK or Germany or Sweden. But on the other hand, the fact that much of the society is more malleable and you can be a big fish in a small pond might mean that in a bunch of regards you're much better off, right? And so you have this strange kind of tipping thing that you have to play with. And so it's just an observation. I'd love to hear you guys if you have specific examples of how you've seen this play out. And I think it plays out in taxes, it plays out in banking, it plays out in residency, it plays out in things like getting speeding tickets, it plays out in things like importing products, it plays out in how you deal with bureaucracy. And to the extent that these are going to affect you, it's really worth noting how you should play in that particular game. So yeah, would love to hear from you guys. Love to hear some examples that you have, and hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you like the video. Appreciate your support, and I will see you on the next video.